say something on top of that. Oh, isn't it great to hear about the History Museum having 1,000 school children through its doors?
Yes.
That has been a long time coming. You know, I'm past president, so when I was serving in that role, that was the hardest piece to figure out. We had lost the educator, and then a couple years after that, the pandemic hit, and just, so there you go. So now, and we've got a great educator at this time, Jennifer. If you haven't met her, you really should. And she's the one who was teaching the kids this, I'm going to say, schnippenschneer, whatever it's called. And all the grown-ups in the room said, I want to do that too. So that's what this workshop's about. It's about something we were teaching the kids, but it's really for the adults. So there you have it. I just wanted to put in a plug for our great staff, and especially the Emerging Education Program. On with the speaker. Tonight's speaker has roots in Southern Virginia that go back to the 1730s. Eric attended the University of Virginia for both undergraduate and law school, and lays claim to having lived in one of Thomas Jefferson's original lawn rooms during his final undergraduate year. He was Martinsville City Attorney from 2003 to 2023, and he's now the General Counsel at our own Roanoke Airport. Eric has served on numerous civic boards as a Virginia Law Foundation Fellow, an honor granted to the top 1% of Virginia lawyers. He's also General Counsel for the Virginia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution and President of the Fincastle Resolutions SAR chapter in Roanoke. He is a member of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His bio for tonight's lecture mentioned how the things he enjoys, sorry, my writing, not his, include history, travel, his 1957 mahogany motorboat, and a 1966 Lincoln convertible. He is also proud to boast that his wife Monica is the executive board chair of Gentry Locke, and their son is a junior at George Mason University and also an aspiring lawyer. That's a lot of lawyers in one household, so there you go. And we're grateful to have him tonight. He threw in that they share their Cave Spring home with 2 hideously spoiled rescue dogs. And so I'm looking forward to tonight's talk, To Live and Die in Liberty, because I've often wondered what the Fincastle Resolutions were. Little did I know that a small group of frontier settlers in our own immediate territory lit the first spark which led to American independence. It is my great pleasure to bring Eric Monday here tonight as he tells us about the amazing bit of history. Please help me welcome Mr. Eric Monday.
So let me say first off what an honor it is to be asked to be giving this Kegley Lecture. Kegley is a name that I think we all know has a great deal to do with the preservation of the history of our region. And so it's an honor to be speaking to you about that tonight. It's an honor to be asked by the Historical Society of Western Virginia, because what a gem we have in that museum. The repository of our entire region's cultural heritage. Also the repository of the O. Winston Link photographic record of the greatest railroad in American history. And it's all housed in a building that was designed by one of the 20th century's greatest design leaders, Raymond Loewy. I mean, it is such a gem to have that here in Roanoke, right in our own backyard. And so I'm very honored to be asked to give this talk tonight. I also see a lot of friends out there, and y'all have to hear me drone on all the time already. So I thank you for coming here this evening. And for those of you who paid $5 to come listen to a fat, bald lawyer talk, as Stephen said, I do practice law, and I will be able to assist you with getting the mental health resources that you clearly need. I don't do divorce. My mom did divorce, and that was the one thing I said I absolutely was not going to do. Just on the 18th, we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the Fincastle Resolutions, which was actually on January 20th. When I first went and approached Ashley, we did not want to do it to coincide with Martin Luther King Day or the presidential inauguration for obvious reasons. and we also wanted to do it on a Saturday. And God truly smiled on us that day. What a beautiful day that was for those of you that went to the ceremony. And it was a big deal, and it should be a big deal. That was the first signature event that VA 250 chose to do to kick off really the 2-year anniversary of American independence and Virginian independence. And you'll hear a little bit more about why it's appropriate that the very first kickoff event occur here in southwestern Virginia in just a second. Because it really did lead to everything else. In 1775 and 1776 are the 2 big years. And for those of you who attended that day and heard Ms. Fiorina's comments about America made in Virginia, and Virginia 250's motto, Virginia's history is America's story, it really is true. And the southwestern Virginia story is a major part of that story. But you don't hear it very often. How many of you in here are native Virginians? I guess, I don't even know if they still teach Virginia history in 4th grade. And I don't know exactly how they teach it, but I guarantee you, both when I grew up and for those who are growing up now and may or may not hear it, you don't hear much about the history of southwestern Virginia. If it's Virginia history is Jamestown and everybody, whether the second sons of the king or nobles, and Pocahontas fell madly in love with John Smith, although she married John Rolfe, and everybody down there lived in beautiful mansions that fronted the river because they had a bunch of slaves that did all the work for them, and that's the story of Virginia that you hear, but that's not really the story of our part of Virginia. It was a very different Virginia out here in the Southwest, and it really doesn't start until the 1720s. So 1607, you have Jamestown. Those are mostly English settlers. They settle in the Tidewater and they filter out through the Piedmont and slowly move west. But the history of, or the colonial history of southwestern Virginia, because there's certainly an indigenous history that goes back thousands and thousands of years before the colonists arrived. But the colonial history of Virginia doesn't really start until 1716, when you have Governor Alexander Spotswood and the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe. Maybe you've heard of them from the dim recesses of Virginia history, 4th grade. The Tidewater and Piedmont settlement had come right up against the Blue Ridge, and Governor Spotswood takes a bunch of his cronies, and they actually go up the mountain and find this beautiful valley on the other side of the crest of the Blue Ridge. He gave them each a golden brooch with gemstones set in it, and they dubbed themselves the Knights of the Golden Horseshoe. And with that, after 1716, settlement starts here in southwestern Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley and the Great Valley and the Valley of Virginia. And that settlement, some of them come over the crest of the Blue Ridge and are of English stock out of the Tidewater and the Piedmont, but the vast majority of the folks that settled our part of Virginia are the flag that you see there, the Scotch Irish. That's the Lion of Scotland and the Red Hand of Ulster, and Germans. We call them the Dutch, but it's actually Deutsch. They were mostly Germans. They were from the Rhineland, the Palatinate, Bavaria, mostly from what we would consider Western Germany. And these folks came into Virginia not out of the Tidewater region. They came in through Maryland and Pennsylvania, and they came up, which is actually south down the valley, but we're supposed to call it going up the valley. And that's how they settled this region. And they were very different from the English gentry or purported gentry of the Tidewater and the Piedmont. The Scotch Irish came over here with, they were Protestant, even if they were from Ireland. These were Protestants that came over from Scotland to Ireland and decided that they would move on from there. These are mostly Northern Ireland settlers, which give us all the tensions you have between Catholic and Protestant Irish to this day. But the Scots and the Irish already had a predisposition to not like the established Church of England. they were dissenters. They were Presbyterians or they were Baptists. They were supporters of the old Stuart dynasty, which is a little ironic because the Stuarts were kind of into absolute monarchy. So they had a predisposition to dislike the Hanoverian kings, George I, II, and III, that were sitting on the throne. And the Germans were similar. Both the Scotch-Irish and the Germans, they had a great memory of either the English Civil War, which was all about absolute monarchy versus parliamentary democracy, and the established church versus worshiping how you want. And their parents and their grandparents would have had a very vivid memory of those horrible battles of the preceding century. If you were German, same thing. Your parents and your grandparents had that memory of the 30 Years' War, where whichever prince that governed the dinky little village you lived in, if he was Catholic, you were Catholic. If he was Protestant, you were Protestant. If you didn't want to do that, you were killed, and your house was burned, and your cattle were taken. And so all of these folks trickled up the Valley of Virginia with a very strong predisposition to not be told what to do, where to live, how to worship, or how to live your lives. They were extremely independent people. One thing they definitely had in common with the people of the Tidewater and the Piedmont was that if the Indians were occupying the land that you'd like to settle on, you should exterminate them. So that was one thing they had in common with the gentry of the eastern part of the Old Dominion. They were also a little different from the gentry in Tidewater and Piedmont in that this was never really a very large slaveholding region, although certainly the horror of slavery was here. And a lot of the horror that you experienced in southwestern Virginia was because we were a transit point. Virginia was also a very big, frankly, breeding and distribution state. And Western Virginia was a point where those slaves transited out of Virginia to points west and points south. And particularly the crossing of the James up around Buchanan was a pretty horrific experience for a lot of those slaves. So the Scotch-Irish and the Germans filter down through the Valley of Virginia, and they come into conflict with the indigenous population here, and also with the colonial rulers a little bit further out to the west, the French. And that goes on through the 1730s and 40s and the late 50s, at which time it erupts into what we call the French and Indian War. That actually spread and became a worldwide war, became the 7 Years' War in Europe. And that ended with the English becoming the masters of North America. That was primarily settled up in Quebec when they defeated the French, but the French were largely driven out of North America, and all of North America became English. And it also set in England at that point truly became a world imperial power, and they also incurred a great deal of debt. And that was really, it was the end of the French and Indian War was what really planted the seeds for the later revolution, because the British came out of that, saddled with a lot of war debt, and they really hadn't taxed the colonists very much before that, and they said, you know what, we incurred this debt to defend you against the Indians and the French, and we think it's only fair that you bear some of that burden, and that in the future you also share in the cost of your common defense. And so they passed what they thought was a series of very reasonable taxation measures, which we call the Intolerable Acts, because we've never really been taxed before. And we also came up with the concept of taxation without representation, because we said, well, you know, these taxes are pretty onerous, but we might be willing to pay some of them if we had representation in England, an English Parliament, just like any other English citizen. And it was the denial of that right that really started to grate on the colonists. But nothing grated on the colonists out here in the Southwest quite like the proclamation line of 1763 at the end of the French and Indian War, when King George III, who you see here on the first part of the screen, proclaimed, in order to protect his indigenous Native American subjects, that no white colonists should settle west of the Blue Ridge and the Alleghenies. And if they did, they were not to be provided the protection of the Crown. This map you see in the middle, I'm going to give credit where credit is due. I shamelessly plagiarized that from Cardinal News because there's no way I could have come up with something that looked that good. And that's where you see the proclamation running right down along the crest of the mountains. When you get to Montgomery County, it actually ran right down the middle of Main Street in current Blacksburg. And if you were to the east of that, you were a legal settler. If you were to the west of that, you were beyond the protection of His Majesty the King. And there were already plenty of people living to the west of that line down here. Where the Fincastle Resolutions was signed, for instance, was significantly west of that line. And that really grated on the colonists here. And they ignored the proclamation line of 1763. They continued to move far to the west of the proclamation line. And that brought them into ever-increasing friction with the Native American tribes, primarily the Shawnee and the Mingo out here in southwestern Virginia. And that really kind of reached a crescendo by the early 1770s when our last royal governor arrived, John Murray, Lord Dunmore, who clearly didn't get the memo and wearing clashing plaids, arrived here in Virginia. When he did arrive here, he was quite popular. I mean, our last royal governor was an extremely popular man when he arrived here. We named a county after him. Doesn't exist anymore. It's Shenandoah County, Woodstock, if you go up I-81. That was once named Dunmore County. And we named another county for his son, little Lord Fauntleroy Fincastle. Fincastle County was carved out of Botetourt County. And it was mostly the parts to the west of us, and that was named after Lord Dunmore's son, the Earl of Fincastle. Obviously his name survives in one place that's still around to this very day. And by 1773, 74, the friction with the Shawnee and the Mingo had really reached a boiling point. It was just a series of endless skirmishes and battles and atrocities, both sides committing pretty significant atrocities. And the Shawnee were led by a chief called Cornstalk, who in 1774, Lord Dunmore called out the colony's militia to crush the Shawnee and the Mingo under Cornstalk, which is exactly what they did in October of 1774 at the Battle of Point Pleasant. This is Lord Dunmore's war, and I'm not going to steal the thunder of a speaker later this season. But that was then in Virginia, although it's currently in far northern West Virginia. This is the monument that is erected at the battlefield of Point Pleasant. And the colonists completely destroyed the Indians. And they did so, and this is important because it's different from the French and Indian War, they did so entirely on their own. These were all Virginia militia supplying themselves, arming themselves, and commanded by themselves, which is entirely different from the French and Indian War when it was the British royal troops that called the tune. And so they came out of this crushing victory in October of 1774, and they had done it all themselves. And what was also going on in 1774? Well, you'd had the Boston Massacre, successfully defended, by the way, those British troops by future President John Adams, who had them acquitted on the grounds of self-defense, because the Boston Massacre was actually a mob that was throwing rocks and ice balls at them. You had the blockade of Boston, you had the coercive acts that had been passed, and there was a lot of stuff going on, primarily out of the northern colonies, but which were well known in Virginia because in 1773 we had formed at the Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg the first committee of correspondence. So the colonies all corresponded back and forth among each other, so they all knew what was going on. And even out here on the far dinky frontier where we're not supposed to know nothing, we knew all about that. And you had these guys that came out of Point Pleasant and they were like, you know what, we can really kick some butt and we can do it on our own. And we don't really like what we hear going on to the north. We are Englishmen, just as valid Englishmen as those on the other side of the Atlantic, and we're a little tired of this. And so you come out of this, it's interesting how much that mood turned between October of 1774, when you win Lord Dunmore's War, and the royal governor is quite popular, to January 20th, 1775, when these men, almost all of them veterans of Point Pleasant, gather at what was then the seat of Fincastle County. And that's not Fincastle, by the way. It's Fincastle County. This was out in Austinville. How many folks have been to Austinville? Okay, I'm delighted to see that. 12 miles off exit 81 exit 80 at Fort Chiswell. Why is it named Austinville? Because it was the birthplace of Stephen Austin, and if you go out there, there's a much more elaborate Texas-sized monument to Stephen Austin that, guess what, was erected by the state of Texas, and they did it Texas style. Actually, I think it's in the shape of a gigantic Texas star that commemorates the birthplace of Stephen Austin. And the poor Fincastle Resolutions are stuck with this boulder that is in someone's front yard. Do not park on the grass when you go out there. That's just a word of advice. I won't tell you exactly how I learned that, but park on the shoulder. And so this is at the edge of someone's yard in Austinville. And the reason that was the seat of Fincastle County was because it was the site of extensive lead mines, which were very important in those days. The Fort Chiswell shot tower that you see down there is just a few miles away. I don't know why they didn't build it next to the lead mines, because I guess you dig the lead out of the ground and then you take it several miles over the shot tower, tote it all the way up to the shot tower, melt it, pour it down through a grate, and it turns into spherical musket balls as it falls down to the bottom of the shot tower in a tub of water. But that whole area was once a center of arms manufacturing, ammunition manufacturing back before the Revolution, and that's why they met there. And I forced my wife to read this thing because the 250th was coming up, the Fincastle Resolutions. And I'm not going to read it to you, but her reaction was, good Lord, that is the most passive-aggressive document I have ever heard. And it is, because they're otherwise like, we are such loyal subjects of our king who we just love. As long as we adhere to everything that was settled at the Glorious Revolution, which limited the power of the king, and as long as we are able to continue to practice the Protestant religion as we see fit, and he observes the rights and liberties of his subjects as they have been established by the compacts, laws, and ancient charters. But we really are loyal to the king, even though he will not defend us from these horrible savages that kill our children and burn our homesteads, these very savages who have incessantly been committing barbarities and depredations on us since our first seating in this country. Even to these remote regions, the hands of unlimited and unconstitutional power hath pursued us to strip us of that liberty and property with which God, nature, and the rights of humanity have vested us. We by no means desire to shake off our duty or allegiance to our lawful sovereign, so long as we can enjoy the free exercise of our religion as Protestants and our liberties and our properties as British subjects. But if no pacific measures shall be proposed or adopted by Great Britain, and our enemies will attempt to dragoon us out of these inestimable privileges, I think there's a document about a year later that inestimable privileges appears in, which we are entitled to as subjects, and wish to reduce us to a state of slavery, we declare that we are deliberately and resolutely determined never to surrender them to any power upon earth, but at the expense of our lives. These are our real, though unpolished sentiments of liberty and loyalty, and in them we are resolved to live and die. I'll take some questions at the end.
That document referred to a constitution. Which
It was the unwritten Constitution of Britain. It was the Constitution that had really come out of the glorious Revolution of 1688. When you got rid of the Stuart dynasty, well, you got rid of James II, who was inclined to become a Catholic monarch and wanted to rule absolutely like his father. And they brought over William and Mary and kicked him out. Britain has never had a written constitution, but that's what they're referring to.
Thank you.
So what is this? Well, this is the very first time that the colonists anywhere, in any of the 13 colonies, put pen to paper and actually came out and said it. Now, there have been some resolutions before that that said, we think you're being unfair, we'd like you to repeal these laws, but they never actually came out and said, we are willing to fight about this. This is the first time this had ever been said. And it happened way out here on the frontier in the middle of nowhere, and surely it happened in a vacuum. Nobody knew what went on, right? Because we are a bunch of hicks out here in the middle of nowhere, right? Wrong. So, what happened? And let me tell you a little bit about the signatories of this thing. I'm not going to go through all, although it was really only 15, but there are some names here that should mean something to all of us as residents of southwestern Virginia, because they really do live on. There's a bunch of Campbells. One of those Campbells, because it's something I'll talk about in a second, was the brother-in-law of Patrick Henry. There was a man named William Christian, also a brother-in-law of Patrick Henry. Two brother-in-laws of Patrick Henry. Think about that when I talk about the next slide. Were signatories of this resolution. William Christian, how does he live on? Christiansburg is named for him. William Ingalls, the husband of Mary Draper Ingalls, he probably had an axe to grind with the Indians because she was taken by the Shawnee and took years to get back to him. John Montgomery, who surveyed the county that was later named for him. William Preston, of course known to us at Greenfields of Botetourt County and Smithfield up there at Virginia Tech. These are some of the signatories of the Fincastle Resolutions. And David Campbell was the clerk of the court of Fincastle County. He, of course, was kin to the other two Campbells. Wrote it all down, gave it to a dispatch writer, and said, go to Williamsburg. And within a week, it's published in the Virginia Gazette and is known throughout the colony. And the committees of correspondence get a hold of it, and within about a month, it's known all up and down the East Coast. And over the ensuing little remainder of January and into February and into March, you have these resolutions popping up all over Virginia. Augusta County, Pennsylvania County, Fairfax, Frederick, all over the place. And you also see them throughout the other colonies that people are like, well, you know, we can do that too. Some of them were more belligerent than this. Some of them were far more fawning and sycophantic of the crown than this. But the fact remains is these took off like wildfire. And most of them were not in the big cities. These were the smaller, rural, frontier, backwater communities that nevertheless had heard about this very quickly for those days and said, you know what, we feel that way too. And so by March 23rd of 1775, you have a meeting, a very important one, that we are going to celebrate the 250th anniversary of. It's the second signature event of VA 250. And that did not occur in Williamsburg because the House of Burgesses was already a little rambunctious and Governor Dunmore did not want them to meet in the colonial capital. And if you'll allow me a little nerd diversion here, y'all know the colonial capital in Williamsburg now is not the colonial capital of the Revolutionary era. That's the first capital that burned in the 1740s when Rockefeller paid to restore Colonial Williamsburg. The architects thought it was a more architecturally attractive building, so they rebuilt that instead of the real colonial capital of the era of the Revolution, which is the building you see below it, which had that two-story portico on it. It didn't have the rounded ends. It was just a simple H-shaped building. Okay, I've said my piece. That's enough nerdness on that. So the governor said, you can't meet in the Capitol. They'd been meeting in the Raleigh Tavern. The meeting, the Virginia, this was the second Virginia convention. The meeting was held to call the question of whether the militia should be called out again to defend the liberties of Virginia citizens. And the governor said, you're not going to meet in the Capitol and discuss that. You're not going to meet in the Raleigh Tavern and discuss that. You're not going to meet anywhere and discuss that because I am the only one who is going to call out the colonial militia. So instead they went up to Richmond and met in St. John's Church. And on March the 23rd, you had the firebrand of Virginia, who may or may not, we'll never know, there's no correspondence recording it, but the brother-in-law of the two signatories of the Fincastle Resolutions stands up in St. John's Church, really ticks off Peyton Randolph, and speaks in favor of calling out the militia, and speaks off the cuff. That amazing speech was delivered extemporaneously. And what comes down to us today is the memory of a young boy who stood outside one of the windows and remembered what he thought was the speech. He also asked to be buried in that churchyard because he found those words to be so inspirational. And Henry carried the day by ending his speech with, "Give me liberty or give me death," building off of what had happened out here in Fincastle just a month and a half before. That's the most famous painting of Henry, by the way. The first one is a portrait of Thomas Sully, much later in life, but the painting that has the action in it is the best known painting of Patrick Henry. That's by a man named Rothermel that was painted in the 1850s. And just to digress a little bit, he never spoke in a chamber that grand. It looks like a Roman temple. And that's not the "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. This is actually his speech against the Stamp Act back in the 1760s. And it's got a lot of symbolism in it. For those of you that really know your Henry, that was the one where he said, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell," and at that point he was interrupted with cries of treason, and he said, "And George III may profit by their example. If this be treason, make the most of it." And you see Rothermel painted him as having thrown down the gauntlet in front of the tyranny of the king. So the speech carried the day, although by a very narrow margin. I mean, I think it's important to remember that everyone was not, "We're ready to drive out the king." This was a very near-run thing. And Henry's eloquence carried the day by only a few votes. The militia was called out. Interestingly enough, Patrick Henry took command of it, and they marched on Williamsburg. And liberty or death obviously became, that's why Patrick Henry is known as the voice of the Revolution. You see it here on the flag of the Hanover Associators. And they marched down on Williamsburg and arrived there just in time to see Governor Dunmore, who was starting to get a little nervous, remove all the gunpowder from the powder magazine. He did so just a day or two before the battles of Lexington and Concord, which you see at the top of this screen. He didn't know about those battles. They'd already happened. As Henry said on March the 23rd, "The next gale that sweeps from the north may bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms." Well, 2 weeks later it happened up there in Massachusetts. And Dunmore was afraid that it was going to happen here, so he removed all the gunpowder from the powder magazines, stuck it on a warship out the York River, which really ticked the colonists off. So he made them reimburse the colony for the cost of the gunpowder. And later on that summer, a Virginia lawyer named St. George Tucker, who was related to a great smuggling family out in Bermuda, went to Bermuda and acquired a supply of gunpowder not only for the colony of Virginia, but for the Continental Army, which by that time was encamped outside of Boston. So St. George Tucker, gunpowder smuggler, later Justice of the Virginia Supreme Court and a United States District Judge. So, we were crooks back then. So that's April and into May in Williamsburg, and then by May and into June, you've got the militia encamped there in Williamsburg. Temperatures and tempers are running high. There's a little skirmish that occurs in mid-May where Governor Dunmore is wounded in the leg. And he'd already sent his family out to this place. The black and white photo is Portobello, which was the governor's weekend retreat outside of Williamsburg. If you go down to Colonial Williamsburg now, when you take the exit to go into Colonial Williamsburg, you go left, you go right into Williamsburg, left is into that secret CIA camp, Camp Perry or whatever they do there. Portobello still stands, but it's in Camp Perry, so you cannot see it. They will shoot you if you try to take a look at it, so don't get too curious. His family's already out at Portobello, but he joins them, and later, and the next day, they leave and get on the HMS Fowey, a warship that's anchored in the York River. And basically at that point, by mid-May of 1775, Dunmore and the Royal Authority are gone. Williamsburg is in the hands of the rebels. Later that year, he issues a proclamation, Dunmore's proclamation, which states he declares the colony to be in rebellion, and he declares that any slave who will leave their master and fight for the king will be given their freedom. And Dunmore's Ethiopian Legion is formed as a result of that. And during the late summer and into the fall, they conduct some raids throughout the Tidewater area of Virginia. And by December, this culminates at the Battle of Great Bridge, where Dunmore and his loyalist forces, British regulars, and the Ethiopian Legion attempt to crush the colonial forces. The colonials are also joined by the primary unit you hear about is the Culpeper Minutemen, who marched all the way down from Culpeper to engage in the Battle of Great Bridge, and that was a resounding defeat for Governor Dunmore and his forces. At that point, Dunmore is well and truly gone. He basically lives on a warship from then on until he leaves Virginia. On New Year's Day of 1776, Dunmore and his naval forces bombard Norfolk, which probably started the fires, but it is generally agreed now that the majority of the burning of Norfolk was actually started by patriots who wanted a propaganda victory against the British. Regardless of who started the fire, Norfolk definitely came out on the short end of the stick there. The city was reduced to ashes, but the patriots certainly made a great propaganda victory out of that. And so that's January of 1776, and by May of 1776, the 5th Virginia Convention meets back in Williamsburg, in the capital, and they declare that Virginia is free of royal authority, which has collapsed, that the governor has abandoned them and abandoned all authority, and they declare Virginia to be independent. And they direct George Mason to write the Declaration of Rights, which survives in every constitution that Virginia has had since. And Richard Henry Lee proposes a motion that is carried in May there in Williamsburg, and then later in June at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, that not just Virginia, but all of the other colonies also declare themselves independent, and that they form a union for their common defense and national sovereignty. All of that comes out of Virginia, and it culminates, well, July 2nd, but we celebrate on July 4th, right? With the Declaration of Independence, authored by another Virginian. But it started here. January 20th, 1775. These are our real, though unpolished sentiments of liberty and loyalty, and in these we are resolved to live and die. A month and a half later, the words of the Revolution: give me liberty or give me death. And then July 4th, we are mutually pledging to each other, the 13 colonies that will form our nation, our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. What happened to Lord Dunmore? Well, he continued to do some raiding from his British warship, but really by the summer of 1776, he sailed away and ultimately wound up back in England. After the Revolution, and by the way, he continued to collect his salary as royal governor until the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, because the king would not acknowledge that Virginia was independent. So Lord Dunmore was therefore still the royal governor of Virginia and entitled to a salary. What did Lord Dunmore do with that? He built that. The Dunmore pineapple on his estate in Scotland, which in 2018 was unanimously voted by the Scottish Institute of Architects as the single most bizarre building in all of Scotland. I don't know if it is available for a vacation rental. I don't know whether that's on Airbnb or not, but anyway, that's how Lord Dunmore spent his salary. In 1786, he did come back to North America as the royal governor of the Bahamas. So that's where he served out his career, and then he retired back to the pineapple. So that's the early story of southwestern Virginia. I'm sort of going to give you the epilogue, because I'm kind of hoping maybe you'll ask me back, because there's a few more details that goes into these stories. But that's how southwestern Virginia contributed mightily to the start of the Revolution and lit that spark that led to American independence and the foundation of our nation. And it's a pity that we don't hear about it. But you know, Virginia textbooks are written in Richmond, and they hardly know we exist. And American history textbooks, for the most part, were written in the North after the Civil War, frankly, and they don't like to acknowledge the South. And that has continued, more or less, in American historiography since. There were several other times that the people of southwestern Virginia contributed mightily to the future of the United States. The first was 1779, when Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson met secretly in Williamsburg and commissioned George Rogers Clark and about 300 Virginians to go out and conquer what became the Northwest Territory. 300 Virginians. And they conquered all of the Northwest Territory. This was not entirely altruistic, because Virginia had always claimed those lands in the Northwest to be part of Virginia. By God, Pennsylvania or New York wasn't going to have it. And so we were just going to go out there and take it. We sent George Rogers Clark out to do it, and he did it. He did it by killing a lot of Native Americans. And I'll digress for a minute and say one of his captains was my ancestor, Leonard Helms, who you see in that painting, who, when the British took back Fort Vincennes, Captain Helms had been left in command of that fort. The British showed up, the French militia that was there assisting him and 3 other Virginians did what the French do best, they ran away. And Leonard Helms rolled a cannon into the gate, got roaring drunk, and held off the British for a couple hours till the other Virginians could get away, until George Rogers Clark at the fort had fallen. Clark marched his men back through that horrible winter frozen march and recaptured the fort. And as a result, Virginia laid claim to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, all of which were referred to as Illinois County, Virginia. We gave that to the nation in 1787, and that became the Northwest Territory, which ultimately entered the Union as free states. That also is the George Rogers Clark flag up there. When they captured Vincennes, there was no blue or white cloth, but plenty of green and red, so that was the best flag they could come up with. So 1779, Virginia, primarily southwestern Virginians, a lot of the veterans of the Battle of Point Pleasant conquered all of this territory, and if we had not conquered it, we would not have kept it in the 1783 Treaty of Paris. So we literally doubled, well, increased by about a third the territory of the new United States by that. And when you think about it, conquering that much territory with a force of about 300 men is a pretty significant tale of military brilliance. Then in 1780, the Southern Campaign, and that's where the rest of southwestern Virginia's service to the nation comes in. And you don't hear about the Southern Campaign. You know, when we are taught revolutionary history, it's Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, the really bad winter at Valley Forge, and then Yorktown. How did they wind up in Yorktown? Everything else is up north. How did that happen? Well, it was because of the Southern Campaign. We never hear about that in school. The northern part of the Revolutionary War had resulted in stalemate by 1779 and into 80, and the British decided we're going to come down here because there's all these loyalists in the South. We're going to invade the South, and we will win the revolution that way because it appears we are not going to do it up north. So they come down here to South, they capture Charleston, they defeat the victor of Saratoga, Horatio Gates, at the Battle of Camden. Southern morale collapses, and things look really dark. The British, the loyalist Tory troops are rising all over the place, and the British strategy appears to be working until October of 1780, when a force of backwoods Hicks gathers at the Abingdon Muster Grounds and Sycamore Shoals over there in eastern Tennessee. They become the Over-Mountain Men by marching over the mountains, and they meet a loyalist force under Patrick Ferguson at the Battle of Kings Mountain and utterly crush him. Ferguson had said, you know, if you don't come over to the service of the king, we will put your homes to the torch and destroy you with fire and sword. That did not go over well back here on the frontier, and so we went down there and crushed him. Who was the commander at Kings Mountain? It was William Campbell, the signatory of the Fincastle Resolutions. Then at the end of 1780, now it's actually January of 1781, a force of Georgia Carolinians, and North and South Carolinians, and Virginia militia, and a few Continentals under the command of Daniel Morgan. The Virginia militia were under the command of David Campbell, the clerk that wrote the Fincastle Resolutions, met the forces of Banastre Tarleton at the Battle of Cowpens and utterly crushed him. And so in the space of those few months, which roughly correspond to October to January back in 1774 and 75, the space between Point Pleasant and the Fincastle Resolutions, in that same space of time, Southern morale completely flips. And then 2 months later, roughly at about the same time Patrick Henry gave his speech, Nathaniel Greene, also commanding a lot of southwestern Virginians, the Virginia Rifles, again under the command of William Campbell, and the Bedford Rifles under the command of Lynch, Colonel Lynch, for whom Lynchburg is named. They meet Cornwallis himself at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. And for those of you who've seen The Patriot, which is really horrible history, that final battle is sort of a merger of Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse, where there's militia up front. They fire a couple times and run away, and the British think they've won the battle, so they rush forward and they go into this melee and are ultimately defeated. That's kind of a mixture of Cowpens and Guilford Courthouse. So Guilford Courthouse, the first line, the North Carolinians run away because they're North Carolinians. The second line is Virginia militia who fire twice and retreat in good order. And the third line are the trained Continentals and some artillery. And the British meshed up with them, and it was a very bloody fight, and Cornwallis decided that the only way he was going to come out of that with a victory was to order his artillery to fire into the whole mass, his own troops and our troops, knowing that his troops, being more disciplined, would hold and that the Americans would break. And that's exactly what happened, and Cornwallis won that battle. But he lost a quarter of his entire army in doing so. And he decided that it would be a really good idea if, for some rest and recuperation and reinforcement, he went to some obscure little port town, and he chose Yorktown, Virginia. And I think we know the rest of that story. None of that would have happened without the contributions of soldiers from here in the Southwest, really significant contributions. But as I said, those details are maybe more appropriate for another lecture some other time, and if I haven't put you to sleep, you'll ask me back and we can talk about that. If any of you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer it. Yes, sir.
Mr. President, do you know where the court records of Fincastle County are now deposited?
I don't know where the court records are deposited. I do know that there is a printed copy of the Fincastle Resolutions in the National Archives. And the Library of Virginia has a duplicate of them, but the Fincastle court records themselves, I don't know where those
I'm
are.
actually referring to marriage records, death records.
Yeah, I'm afraid I don't know where those are. No idea. And Fincastle County would not have, Fincastle County was abolished in the Revolution, and ultimately broken up into a lot of smaller counties. You know, another interesting thing is you can kind of tell the difference between pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary Virginia by just looking at a map and looking at the names of the counties. When you look at pretty much everything to the east of us, those are all British, aristocratic, noble names, or also to the north of us. The Lord of Botetourt, the Earl of Fincastle, Princess Augusta, Princess Charlotte, Queen Charlotte, the Duke of Mecklenburg, the Duke of Brunswick, William Pitt, the Earl of Chatham. I mean, they even named the county seat for that guy. So when you go to the east, it's all British royal. If you go to the west, right about where we are now, they tend to be more patriotic names: Carroll County, Wythe County, Lee County, Dickinson County, Russell County, Washington County, Floyd County, all of the Montgomery. All of those are names of patriots or people that came after the Revolution. So the dividing line is right where we are now. And you can just look at a map and see it.
I'm moved by the young clerk Campbell, who is highly visible when he puts his signature on it. I mean, you're the clerk.
Yeah.
People know you. Some of these
Yeah.
other guys, maybe people...
Well, they'd all put their signature on it.
They all
as
put
well.
it there, but
Yeah.
that really is a defining moment for that young...
And he's really the one who, you know, he gave it to the postwriter and said, get to Williamsburg as fast as you can. So that it didn't happen in a vacuum, so that people knew about it. And so that just a month and a half later, you've got that speech that really took things off. And within a matter of months, royal authority has just evaporated.
After the Revolution, there were immense number of land grants in Montgomery County, Washington, and of course Kentucky.
Yep.
But where are the records?
Yeah.
There's a transcription of most of the
Yeah,
records
I've seen the transcription.
in
but I've never
the
seen
annals of
the
Southwest Virginia.
I've seen the transcription. but I've never
Don't they
seen
also
it.
have the letter that Patrick Henry's sister sent?
Mm-hmm.
Pretty clearly states a lot of.
And she herself was pretty impressive in her
Yes.
own right. She is, that was William Campbell's widow. He died before her. They're buried together out in Marion. But she is responsible for a lot of the spread of Methodism all throughout southwestern Virginia and on into eastern Tennessee and Kentucky. She was quite impressive in her own right.
Any other questions? Hands here.
Yes, sir.
So you said there's an original. Anything I've ever read is there's the only primary source is what was in the Virginia Gazette. So I guess if
Oh,
that's
no,
the case,
it's
when
not
did
the
they find
original.
that?
It is a duplicate of the. I think it is in fact something from the Virginia Gazette.
Yeah.
That's what's in the National
Oh, okay.
Archive.
All right.
Yeah. No, it is not. The original resolution has not survived.
You have a question here?
Yes, sir.
Not exactly a question, but I guess I'm going to boast a little bit. My brother was standing here now. Charles Cummings was our fifth great grandfather.
Well, you need to join our chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution.
There you go.
Yes, ma'am.
What is that?
That